Hey folks, tonight we lace up and step into something a little less comfortable. The workshop of a medieval shoemaker, a place that smells like boiled leather, wet straw, and decades of unspoken regret. This isn't the romantic Middle Ages of knights and troubadours. This is the part they left out of the paintings, the part where your job involves scraping cowhide with a blunt knife and softening it in. Well, we'll get to that. There's no magic here, no elves fixing shoes overnight, just you, a crooked bench, and a whole day of stabbing your own fingers with a dull needle. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if the scent of fermented goatskin doesn't scare you off. And let me know in the comments, what time is it for you, and what are you wearing on your feet? Hopefully something soft. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's slowly hobble, into a day in the life of a medieval cobbler. You won't last long, but that's okay, most people didn't. You wake up with your feet numb and your nose full of mildew. It's not exactly a gentle awakening. There's no sunrise through the curtains. There are no curtains, just a wall that sweats. The first thing you feel is dampness. Not a little cold kind of damp. This is the kind that seeps through the straw mattress, clings to your wool blanket like a wet dog, and settles into your bones with the determination of a long-term tenant. The room is dark, not night dark, just always dark. One small hole in the wooden slats above your bed lets in a line of smoky daylight, enough to see the spiders. They don't pay rent either. You try to stretch, but remember you can't. There's not enough room. Your bed, if you can call a bundle of straw and a board a bed, is wedged between the fireless hearth and a pile of leather scraps. The ceiling is so low you could kiss it if your neck weren't so stiff. You sit up slowly. Something crunches. You don't ask what. Could be a beetle. Could be a piece of dried glue. Could be both. You shiver and swing your legs down. The stone floor greets you with the kind of cold that makes your toes question all your life choices. And it smells. Not a specific smell, just the smell. A warm, sour cocktail of old boots, wet fabric, wood rot, and time. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone coughs. It's your apprentice. He sleeps under the workbench, wrapped in a horse blanket and the smell of despair. There's no clock, but you know it's morning because the rats have stopped moving. They only party at night. The rooster doesn't crow here. He moved out last winter, probably smarter than you. You reach for your tunic. It's still damp from yesterday's rain, or sweat, or both. The leather apron you wear hangs from a nail that used to hold something important. Now it just holds obligation. As you get dressed, you notice a new hole in your sock. That makes 5. You smile briefly, only because it's the one thing around here that's trying to breathe. You chew on a piece of stale bread from the night before. It tastes like it's been aging since the Crusades. You swallow it dry. There's no water. Boiling it takes firewood, and firewood costs money. And besides, you don't drink water unless you have to, not after what it did to your cousin. You glance at the door. It doesn't really open. It leans. The hinges gave up a few summers ago. But outside that leaning door waits the workshop, the day's first shoes, and the sharp needle that will soon meet your fingertip. Again. You sigh. Not because you're dramatic. You just haven't exhaled in a while. Then you stand up, slowly. Your knees pop. Your back mutters something impolite. And just like that, the day begins. Again. The mold greets you like an old friend. The smell of leather and ammonia lingers in the air. And somewhere in the corner, a mouse sneezes. Welcome back to the cobbler's life. You've survived the night. But only barely. You duck under the crooked doorway and step into the workshop. The air greets you first. Thick, still, a mixture of boiled hide, old glue, and whatever sweat got trapped in here last summer. The smell doesn't hit you all at once. It settles on you, like an extra layer of clothing you didn't ask for. There are no windows. Of course not. Windows are for people who need sunlight. You, apparently, do not. Light comes from one oil lamp, hanging just low enough to burn your forehead if you forget to duck. It flickers, not romantically, but like it's reconsidering its will to live. The walls are the color of regret. At some point, they were wood. Now they're mostly just leather dust and ash, held together by cobwebs and damp. You've long stopped brushing anything off your sleeves. The dust comes back faster than your patience. There's a bench in the center, wobbly, warped and stained with every glue, dye, and tear ever spilt here. Your tools are laid out neatly, but not because you're organized. You just haven't had the energy to move them in weeks. The awl, the punch, the curved blade, all faithful little instruments of discomfort. A pair of boots sits in the corner, half-stitched, one eyelet short, quietly judging you. The air doesn't move in this room. There's no breeze, no draft, just heat in the summer and damp in the winter, sometimes both, if the roof's leaking, which it is, always. Your apprentice shuffles in behind you, still chewing on yesterday's regret and this morning's bread. He doesn't say anything. He's learned not to. Talking just uses air, and air is already too thick with the smell of sour dye and wet wool. The leather for today's order lies on the floor in a pile, slightly green around the edges. It's technically usable, but if it gets any riper, you might have to name it and charge it rent. You run your fingers along the hide. It's stiff, not cured properly. The tanner must have rushed it, or hated you, possibly both. You take a breath, instantly regret it, and begin. Cut, punch, sew, press, repeat. That's the rhythm here. No music, no conversation. Just the sound of thread tearing through flesh-thick cowhide, and the occasional sigh that sounds suspiciously like a death wish. You shift on your stool. It creaks like a haunted violin. Your knees complain. Your spine threatens rebellion. But your hands keep moving. Because this is the workshop, a place with no windows. Just work. And the smell, always the smell, today's leather, comes from a cow that died a week ago. Not that you asked how long it had been dead. No one talks about that. But the smell tells you everything. It's the kind of smell that doesn't just float through the room. It sinks into it, into the walls, the tools, your clothes, your lungs. The hide arrives folded, stiff, and slightly damp in all the wrong ways. You unfold it, and it groans. Yes, groans. As if it too knows this isn't what it signed up for. The surface is uneven, rough, and splotchy in colour, part brown, part grey, part something, greenish. You poke it with your finger. It pushes back. That's not a good sign. You drag the hide over to the workbench. It's heavier than it looks. Wet leather always is. It slaps against the wood with a sound that could silence conversation, if anyone here still bothered speaking. Now, the fun part. It's too hard to work with in its current state, which means it needs to be softened. And no, you can't afford fancy oils or imported balms. Those are for shoemakers, who serve nobles. You serve peasants and sometimes horses. So you do what you've always done. You reach for the bucket in the corner. It doesn't look like much, just a plain wooden pail, but it's filled with a time-tested softening agent. Urine. Human. Aged. Sometimes yours. Sometimes your apprentice's note. You don't ask questions. It works. You dip a rag into the liquid. The smell rises instantly. Not sharply, more like a creeping cloud of ammonia and shame. Your eyes water. Your throat tightens. And for a moment, you wonder what choices led you here. But not for long. You've got shoes to finish. You rub the urine-soaked cloth over the leather slowly, pressing the liquid into the stiff hide. The skin starts to bend, reluctantly. You press harder. The stench clings to your fingers. It always does. You could scrub for hours and still carry the scent with you, like an invisible tattoo. Your apprentice watches from the corner, nose wrinkled. You tell him, again, this is tradition. He doesn't believe you. You don't believe you, either. But it's what works. Once the leather softens, you hang it over a wire to dry. Just slightly. Not too long. If it dries too much, it'll harden again. If it stays wet, it rots. This job is about balance. The balance between too soft and too brittle. Between nausea and suffocation. Between just enough stink and an actual medical emergency. You sit back and look at the dark, dripping piece of cow. In a few hours, it'll be a shoe. Maybe two. Someone will wear it to work. Or a funeral. Or the market. It will walk, even if you barely can. You stretch your shoulders. They pop like old hinges. The hide sighs. Or maybe that was you. And just like that, the leather is ready. More or less. The steps never change. Cut. Sew. Glue. Wait. You've done it so many times your body moves before your brain does, like a dance choreographed by repetition and resignation. First, you cut. The knife is old, so are you. Both of you are a little dull but still get the job done, eventually. The blade drags through the leather with a sound like someone slowly tearing through damp cloth. Your fingers guide it carefully, tracing lines you've drawn so many times they now live in your muscle memory. Still, sometimes the leather fights back. It shifts at the last second. Your hand slips, and then, just a little nick, a sharp sting. You glance down. Another cut. Your thumb bleeds. Again. You suck the wound briefly, not because it helps, but because there's nothing else to do. There are no bandages, just a scrap of cloth nearby, already stained with a dozen other mistakes. You wrap it tight and keep going. Next, the needle. Thick, bent, slightly rusty, like everything else in this place. You thread it with waxed linen string, tough, coarse, designed to hold together even after the shoe falls apart. You push the needle through the hide, using your thumb to guide it. The leather resists. Your hand cramps. Your palm sweats. The needle bites you twice before you finish the second stitch. The blood mixes with the wax. You keep going. Sewing a shoe isn't delicate work. It's war. The leather stretches. The thread pulls. The sole refuses to sit flush. You grunt. You mutter. You try again and again until it gives in. Or you do. Then comes the glue. A thick paste, mixed by hand, stored in a pot that smells like fermented tree sap and broken dreams. You smear it on with your fingers, pressing sole to upper, holding your breath as it bonds. You wait. 10 minutes. Sometimes more. Sometimes less. You lose track of time easily when you're bleeding from your knuckles. Finally, you set the shoe near the fire. Not too close, just enough warmth to help it dry, without curling the toe like a witch's boot. You stretch your back. It cracks like old leather. You look down at your hands, red, raw, and speckled with glue, thread, and fingerprints that no longer scan. You do this all day. Cut, sew, glue, wait. Each pair the same. Each pain slightly different. And even if the shoes change size, color, or destination, your fingers always remember, especially the places they've been pierced. And you will bleed again tomorrow, because you always do. It's part of the process now. Just like breathing, your chair is older than you, possibly older than time. No one remembers who made it. Whoever did clearly hated posture. It's not really a chair, anyway, just a warped plank of wood nailed to 4 mismatched legs, one of which is shorter and has been balanced with a folded scrap of leather since last winter. You keep meaning to fix it. You won't. You lower yourself onto it with the caution of someone disarming a trap. It groans under your weight. Not just creaks, groans. A long, drawn-out protest that sounds disturbingly human. You mutter, "Me too," and shift slightly. The sound gets worse. Every time you move, it complains. Every time you breathe too hard, it threatens collapse. You've stopped caring. The chair hasn't. Your spine curves naturally forward now. Not because you want it to, but because years of leaning over shoes has bent you into the shape of a question mark. Your shoulders ache. Your neck tightens. Your hips feel like rusted hinges on a church gate. And yet somehow, the worst part is the splinter that's been poking your left thigh since last week. You haven't pulled it out. Maybe you're afraid the whole chair will fall apart if you do. Maybe you're afraid you will. You shift again. There it is. The sound has become a rhythm. Stitch, sigh, creak, punch, curse, creak. Even your apprentice knows it. When he hears the chair shift 3 times in a row, he knows you're about to lose your patience. He hides. You once tried swapping the chair out for a crate. That lasted an hour. Then your back seized up, and you shouted at a piece of thread for 10 minutes. The chair might be torture, but it's familiar torture. There's a small indentation on the seat, worn smooth by years of sitting in the exact same spot, doing the exact same thing, day after day. The wood is permanently shaped to the misery of a working man. It hugs your despair like an old friend. Sometimes you wonder if the chair is the only thing in your life that truly understands you. There it goes again. You try to stretch, but the motion is limited. One leg goes numb around hour 4. Your lower back goes silent around hour 6. That's usually a bad sign. By hour 8, you're not sure if you're still sitting or just slowly becoming part of the chair itself. Some men say their tools are an extension of their body. You think maybe your chair is an extension of your soul, worn, uneven, and barely holding together with rusted nails and habit. But still, you sit. Because what else can you do? Stand all day? You tried that once. Your knees filed a complaint and refused to report to work for a week. You reach for another sole. The chair wobbles, then settles. You grunt. The air doesn't move. Your heartbeat thuds against your lower back like someone knocking on a locked door. And the chair, still here, still suffering, right along with you. Lunch is not an event. It's more like an interruption. A reluctant pause in the slow unraveling of your spine. You don't go anywhere. There's no break room, no courtyard, no picnic bench with a view of birds and sunlight. You just lean back, very slightly, and reach for the cloth bundle tucked beneath your bench. The cloth used to be white. Now it's textured. Inside, a piece of bread. Hard, dry, mostly crust. The kind of bread that fights back when you bite it. If you dropped it, it might break the floor, or your toe. It's not fresh. Of course not. Fresh bread costs coin. This one was baked sometime last week, and has spent the days since aging like a retired soldier. Quiet, rigid, and mildly resentful. You snap off a corner with your teeth. It flakes like old plaster. There's no butter, no cheese, no meat. There's hope, and even that's going stale. You chew slowly, partly to make it last, mostly because your jaw needs time to remember how to work. Every bite echoes in your skull. You don't bother wiping your hands. The glue is already on the bread now. The taste is industrial, bitter, with a hint of pine. You tell yourself it's seasoning. Your apprentice sits across the room, gnawing on something equally lifeless. He drops a piece, picks it back up, dusts it on his sleeve, and shrugs. 5-second rule? Try 5-century rule. The workshop is quiet except for the usual sounds. A fly buzzing somewhere near the glue pot. The soft groan of leather stretching in the heat. And that one boot that just fell off the shelf again. It always does. You don't talk during lunch. Not because of manners, there are none left, but because your mouth is busy and your mood is low. Words are wasted when your jaw is working this hard. Occasionally, a customer walks in mid-bite. You stand too fast, forget the glue on your hands, and leave a fingerprint on your face. The customer frowns. They always do. You apologize through crumbs. They complain about their soles. You nod and offer them a bench that's more wobbly than yours. They don't stay long. The smell does. You return to your bread. It's now slightly soggy, where your fingers held it. You finish the last bite out of duty, not pleasure. Then, with a sigh that sounds like it's been waiting all morning, you toss the empty cloth aside and wipe your hands on your apron. The glue doesn't come off. It never does. You stretch once. Your back protests. Your hip pops. Your stomach is confused but quiet. Lunch is over. Time to return to the noble art of stabbing your hands for coin. Eventually, someone knocks on the frame that used to be a door. Not a loud knock. Just enough to announce presence without fully committing to entering. That's how they all do it. Customers. You look up, mid-stitch, glue drying on your fingers and thread in your teeth. You mumble something that sounds like, "Come in," but it comes out more like, "Kunf." They step inside carefully, as if afraid the floor might bite them. They always pause just inside the threshold, eyes scanning the room like tourists in a foreign country where the only language spoken is functional discomfort. And they are always, without exception, cleaner than you. Even the poorest customers have that look, recently washed, vaguely floral, not yet stained by the despair of this particular room. Their boots may be broken, but their collars are crisp. Their hair behaves. Their teeth are visible. Meanwhile, you haven't shaved in 2 weeks. Your shirt could be considered a historical artifact, and your apron smells like a mixture of vinegar and ancient defeat. You stand up, slowly, trying not to groan. Your chair creaks behind you like it's warning them. You wipe your hands on your apron, which only moves the grime from one part of your palm to another. "Something wrong with the shoe?" you ask. They wrinkle their nose before answering. Not because of the question, because of the air. They hold up a boot. The sole is flapping like a loose tongue. It came apart, they say, in a tone that suggests betrayal. You nod, take the boot, and examine it. It's not your work. You can tell. Your stitches don't unravel that way. Yours hold on far past the point of usefulness. Like you. You name a price. They blink, frown, and counter with a figure that might buy you a nail. Maybe. You agree. You always agree. Because you need the coin. Because the last customer paid in turnips. Because the landlord does not accept good intentions as rent. As you set the boot on the bench, their eyes wander. They look at the piles of leather, the glue pot, the drying rack, the apprentice scratching his head with a sewing awl. They look like they're trying not to judge. They fail. You pretend not to notice. It's easier that way. Sometimes they ask questions. Why does it smell like that in here? What is that in the corner? Is that blood on the sole? You offer vague answers. You don't mention the ammonia, or the mice, or that yes, that probably is blood. The conversation never lasts long. They don't linger. They never do. They pay, reluctantly, then disappear back into the world of fresh air and unsticky hands. You watch them leave, eyes on their clean cuffs and uncracked heels. You used to envy that. Now you just wonder how they keep their shirts so white. You turn back to the bench. The boot stares up at you, broken, expectant, slightly damp. You sit. Your chair groans, and the room returns to normal. Just you, the glue, the leather, and the faint scent of someone better off than you, still hanging in the air. The headache starts sometime after lunch. Not suddenly. It creeps in, slow and sticky, like the smell of warm glue in a windowless room, which, coincidentally, is exactly where you are. You try to ignore it. You always try. But the moment you uncap the dye pot, it hits full force. The dye is dark, somewhere between black and purple, but also with hints of regret and rot. It's thick, clings to the brush like it knows better, and smells like fermented vinegar got into a fight with cheap wine and lost. You dip the brush. The fumes rise. Your sinuses tighten. Your eyes water. Your head pulses like someone knocking on the inside of your skull with a leather mallet, gently for now. You lean in to focus. The brush trembles slightly in your hand. You try to steady it. The headache steadies with you. Every stroke adds color to the leather and pressure to your temples. Then there's the softening agent, a separate villain. The second you open the jar, your stomach flinches. It's an old concoction passed down from one miserable generation to the next. You're not sure what's in it. Animal fat, a bit of lye, maybe the ghost of a dead tanner. Whatever it is, it has presence. You smear it onto the stiffer sections of hide, massaging it in with the kind of affection you haven't shown a human being in years. The leather groans. You do too. The headache climbs from the back of your neck to the crown of your head. It lingers behind your eyes, pulsing in time with your heartbeat and your mounting irritation. You try breathing through your mouth. Now your tongue tastes like dye. You blink. The edges of the room go fuzzy. The colors dim slightly. You rub your eyes. Bad idea. There was glue on that finger. Now your eyelid is tacky and your vision smells like solvents. Somewhere nearby, your apprentice sneezes. You hear a pot clatter. A rat scurries. The workshop hums with the music of nausea. You sit back for a moment, try to stretch. The air presses down on you like wet cloth. The roof creaks above, like it too is overwhelmed by the odor. You reach for a cloth and wipe your face. The cloth had dye on it. Now your nose is purple. You don't care. You've long accepted that your body is just another surface in this workshop. Something to be stained, bent, and worn down like everything else. The headache doesn't leave. It just shifts, moves behind your right ear, and sits there like an unwanted guest who won't stop sighing. You drink from your tin mug. The water tastes like yesterday's leather. You pretend it helps. It doesn't. You return to the brush. You still have 3 pairs left to color. The dye is drying fast. Your patience isn't. And through it all, the headache stays. Steady, loyal, familiar. Like a co-worker. Or an old friend. One who never stops talking. The headache doesn't announce itself. It creeps in, quiet at first. A dull pressure behind your eyes. a gentle throb at the back of your skull, like someone knocking politely inside your head. You know exactly what caused it. The dye pot is bubbling in the corner, has been for the last hour, a foul stew of crushed oak bark, soot, ash, and something vaguely organic that no one talks about. The fumes drift through the room, slow and sticky, curling into your nose like an unwelcome thought. And then there's the softening agent, the one made from aged urine, left in a sealed bucket until it gains character. It's open now. You had to soak a batch of souls. The smell rises like bad news. Sharp, acidic. It lingers in your mouth like a bad argument. You try to breathe through your mouth. It doesn't help. The air tastes like heated vinegar and regret. You blink slowly. Your eyes sting. Your head pulses with every heartbeat, like someone's pressing the edge of a boot sole against your temples, rhythmically, without mercy. You reach for a cloth, tie it over your nose and mouth. It's symbolic, like putting a curtain over a broken window, but you do it anyway. Not because it works, but because it makes you feel slightly more in control of your own suffering. Your apprentice, sitting across from you, isn't faring much better. His face is pale, his lips dry. He's stitching silently, shoulders hunched, eyes glazed. You admire his commitment. Or maybe it's just survival instinct. Hard to tell. The dye bubbles louder, the fumes thicken. You stir it carefully with a stick that used to be part of a broom. The color is rich, deep brown, almost black. It'll look beautiful on the leather, if your customers are too polite to ask what it was made from. Some workshops use cleaner methods, safer chemicals, better air, but those require coin. And coin, like fresh air, is rare in this line of work. You press your fingers to your forehead. Your skin is warm, not fever warm, just slowly boiled, living warm. The kind of heat that doesn't sweat out, it just settles in. You try to distract yourself by finishing a shoe. Needle in, needle out, pull tight, repeat. But your fingers fumble, the thread knots, your eyes blur. And still, the work doesn't stop, because the orders keep coming. The dye must be stirred, the leather must be softened, the fumes must be breathed. This isn't poison, not exactly. It's just normal. You don't complain. You've learned that complaining uses more air. And here, air is something you ration like bread. The headache pulses again, sharper now. You squint through the haze, reach for a pair of half-dyed soles, and begin the next step. The shoe won't wait. And neither will the smoke. Even among shoes there are hierarchies. And you're not at the top. You're not even on the shelf. Some leather gets treated like royalty. Soft calfskin, imported dyes, embroidered lining, soles so smooth they squeak on polished marble floors. Those shoes are made in workshops with windows, by men with last names etched into brass plaques, men who don't have glue under their fingernails, men who smell like tobacco, not ammonia. Then there's you. You work with scraps, with hides that have seen things, scuffed, sun-dried, and sometimes slightly green around the edges. You sew with coarse thread, bend soles with bare hands, and pray the glue holds long enough for the first rain. There are shoes for the nobles, and shoes for the rest of us. And even within that rest, there are layers. Farmers get thick soles, stitched twice, but only because their boots are expected to last through mud, frost, and the occasional unfortunate chicken. Blacksmiths get reinforced heels. Masons get steel tips. Everyone else gets what's left. You know which shoes are going to which feet without asking. The wealthy don't come in person. They send messengers, boys too clean to be yours, carrying handwritten notes and half a coin as deposit. They never look you in the eye. You're not offended. You're used to it. Even the boots you make for them get treated better than you do. Polished daily, stored with care, stuffed with lavender. Meanwhile, the shoes you make for your own feet are theoretical. You've stitched a pair together from rejects. Leather too stiff, soles too thin. They're ugly, uneven, and technically two different sizes, but they're yours. Still, you wear them carefully, because you can't afford to ruin them. You can't afford anything. Even in this craft, done with blood, sweat, and other bodily fluids best left unnamed, some shoes are born lucky. You once made a pair for a nobleman's wedding. Rich brown leather, dyed twice, stitched with waxed linen, lined with wool. It took you 4 days. You worked through a fever, through a leak in the roof, through an apprentice accidentally stabbing your arm with an awl. You never saw the man who wore them. You heard he stepped in horse manure 10 minutes into the ceremony. You wish that had made you feel better. It didn't, because the truth is this. You don't make shoes for yourself. You make them for people who walk on you. And if one day, by miracle or madness, you rise above this bench and step into better shoes, they'll still smell like this workshop. He showed up on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Thursday. You don't really count days anymore. Just stitches and headaches. He was skinny, not the kind of skinny that comes from youth, but the kind that suggests someone's been living on boiled roots and disappointment. You looked at his hands first, bony, nervous, not built for knives or needles, but here he was, another apprentice. You didn't ask his name right away. You just pointed to the stool by the corner, told him not to sit unless he was dying. You weren't joking, you just didn't want to share your stool. Training an apprentice is tradition. It's how the craft survives. Or at least, that's what people say. In reality, you teach someone because there's too much to do, and your knees can't hold you forever. And maybe, just maybe, because it's nice having someone bring your lunch once in a while. He was clumsy at first. Dropped the awl. Broke 2 needles. Saturday, on a half-finished sole. You sighed a lot that week. Loudly. Dramatically. You didn't mean to. It just happens when your work gets trampled. Literally. Still, he stayed. That was new. Most don't. Most smell the glue, hear the rats, and vanish before you can explain the difference between a welt and a vamp. One left during lunch. Another made it until his first finger bled. But this one? He kept showing up. And he learned. Slowly, painfully. The kind of learning that comes with scabs and squinting in low light. His stitches were crooked, his soles uneven, but he got better. Not good. Just better. You taught him how to soften leather without soaking it to soup, how to line up the eyelets so the laces don't cross like drunks in an alley, how to tell, by smell alone, if the glue has turned to vinegar. In return, he brought food, bread that wasn't always stale, soup sometimes, a heel of cheese once, which you almost cried over. You told him to stop spoiling you. He thought you were joking. You weren't. You never said it out loud, but it was easier with him there. The bench felt less heavy, the silence less sharp. Some days, you catch him humming. Some days, you let him. Because even in a place that smells like boiled despair, even when your fingers ache and your lungs taste like dye, a little company makes it bearable, even if he's just there to hand you a crust of bread, or a hammer, or a reason not to throw the whole damn shoe into the fire. You've never seen a battlefield, but your shoes have. They've marched through blood-soaked fields and frozen forests, stomped over broken helmets, shattered flags, and maybe even a few unburied regrets. You didn't choose that. You just made the boots. A soldier came once, broad-shouldered, young, loud. He laughed when he stepped into the workshop, then coughed when the smell caught up with him. He wanted something sturdy, something that would last at least a few battles. You said, "No boot lasts more than one if the arrow's aimed well." He laughed again. You didn't. You made him a pair anyway. Heavy soles, double-stitched, oiled leather, iron nails in the heel. You didn't ask what side he fought for. You didn't care. Leather doesn't bleed. People do. He thanked you, paid in silver, and walked out with a confidence you haven't felt in 20 years. You watched his boots disappear into the street mud, wondering if they'd still be on his feet a month from now, or if someone else would be wearing them, or burying them. Because boots travel farther than their makers. You've made shoes for weddings, for funerals, for market trips, and prison marches. But the war boots always feel heavier, not just because of the metalwork, but because you know what they're walking toward. You've heard the stories. You've seen the veterans. The ones who return with missing limbs and eyes that stare too far inward. They don't complain about your stitching. They don't ask for polish. They just want something that doesn't hurt when it rains. Once, a pair came back. Well, half a pair. Found on a cart of salvage. brought to you by a man who said nothing but handed it over like it was a headstone. The toe was blown open, the laces gone, but your maker's mark, faint, hidden under the arch, was still there. You recognized your work. You always do. You set it on a shelf behind you, next to the other things that don't speak but say too much. And yet, you keep making them, because war doesn't stop for cobblers, and neither does demand. You hammer soles while cannons fire in the distance. You stitch heels while news arrives about another village, another sun, another flag lowered. Your hands shake sometimes, not from fear, just fatigue. They've been shaking for years. Still, when the order comes, you shape the leather, trim the edges, punch the holes. You run your fingers along the curve of the sole and wonder if it'll step on soil, stone, or something softer. You'll never see the battlefield. You'll never carry a sword. No one will sing about the man who made the boots. But when a soldier takes his final step, chances are it'll be in your work. And somehow, that's enough. The day doesn't end with a bell. It ends when your body gives out before your work does. There's no sunset to mark the close, just the oil lamp burning lower, flickering against the soot-stained wall. The flame coughs like you do. You wonder which of you will go first. You set down your last shoe of the day. Not finished, just postponed. The glue hasn't dried. Your patience hasn't either. But your back says enough, and you've learned to listen when your bones speak louder than your ambition. You stretch your fingers. They don't move right away. The muscles have stiffened into the shape of work, half clawed, half curled. You massage your palms. A small, dull pain reminds you of the time you drove a needle through your own thumb. You smile. It's almost nostalgic. Your nails are blackened at the edges. Not dirt, glue, dried thick like resin. You pick at it with the tip of a knife, flaking it off slowly. It snaps off in chunks, some dragging skin with it. You don't wince. You just watch, like someone trimming bark from an old branch. Then there's the thread. You reach up and find it tangled in your beard again, a single pale strand, looped in like it belongs there. You don't remember when it got caught, sometime between your fourth sole and your fifth sigh. Probably. You tug it free. It resists, just a little, like the day itself, unwilling to let go. Your apprentice is already half asleep near the wall, curled into a blanket that smells like smoke and youth. You envy his silence. You remember when your knees didn't crack every time you stood, when your eyes didn't blur after 6 hours of squinting at seams, when you had a reason to count the days instead of just surviving them. You pour a cup of water, sip it slowly. It's warm from being too close to the fire, tastes faintly of wood, ash, and iron. You drink it anyway, not because it's good, but because it's there. Outside, the street is quiet, or quieter than usual. You hear a cartwheel in the distance, a dog barking, someone coughing 3 doors down, the usual lullaby. You blow out the lamp. The darkness returns, familiar and complete. You lie down on the straw pile again. It hasn't gotten softer. You've just gotten used to it. Your fingers throb. Your shoulders ache. Your head hums with the memory of stitching. But the shoes are still here. And so are you. You survived another day. That's the job. That's the miracle. And tomorrow, it starts again. With a creaking chair, a blunt needle, and glue under your nails. So, would you last a day as a medieval shoemaker? Let's be honest, you probably wouldn't. Not because you're weak, but because no one really was built for this. Not the darkness, not the glue that burns your eyes, not the stools that bend your back into a question mark, not the smell of boiled leather and ammonia that settles in your lungs like soot in a chimney. You'd miss things, like soap, and bandages, and food that didn't come with a warning label. You'd wonder why anyone would do this job, why anyone would wake up, day after day, just to bleed into a pair of boots they could never afford to wear. Why anyone would stitch through pain, breathe through rags, and call a pile of straw a bed. And yet, they did. Thousands of them. Unnamed, unpaid, unremembered. Men who worked quietly behind the scenes of history, so someone else could march, marry, or mourn in shoes that didn't fall apart by noon. This wasn't art. It wasn't even pride. It was survival. And survival, in this world, was more than enough. So tonight, As you wiggle your toes in clean socks and step across warm floors toward a bed that doesn't smell like mold, maybe think of them. The hands that stitched, the backs that broke, the people who made the steps possible, even if they never walked far themselves. They may not have written history, but they supported it. Literally. Good night. You wouldn't expect much from a little girl born in 1828 in a small town called Varanasi, India. The British didn't. Most people didn't. She wasn't born into luxury. She didn't have silk cradles or diamond toys. What she had was a courtyard, a wooden horse, and a father who saw no reason why a girl shouldn't learn to ride like a boy. Her name was Manikarnika, but even that name, soft and flowing like the Ganges River, wouldn't last forever. People would later call her Rani Lakshmi Bai, but at the beginning, she was just Manu. She didn't go to school the way children today do. There were no pencils, no uniforms, no weekly spelling tests. Instead, she learned how to draw a sword, how to sit straight on a moving horse, how to fire an arrow into a spinning target. She wasn't playing warrior, she was becoming one. This was not common. Girls in 19th century India were expected to be quiet, modest, and invisible. They were expected to be good daughters, and later, good wives. But Manu's daily routine looked nothing like that. Her feet were dusty, her sleeves rolled up, her voice not hushed but firm. She practiced with the boys. She beat them, often. And when she fell, she got up without waiting for help. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't loud. She wasn't a slogan or a movement. She was just herself. And somehow, being fully herself was already a form of rebellion. She had no idea the British Empire was watching. She didn't know that her life would soon cross paths with colonial policies, power struggles, and battles that would fill textbooks. All she knew was that she liked the feeling of wind on her face when she galloped. She also liked books, Sanskrit scriptures, political texts, poems, not the kind of reading expected of a Brahmin girl, but she did it anyway. The world outside her gate was changing, but she was preparing quietly, like a seed underground, the kind no one notices until it breaks through stone. By the time she was a teenager, she wasn't just skilled, she was sharp. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, people listened. Her intelligence wasn't loud. It was the kind that made adults pause before they replied. Then came marriage. In those days, girls married young, often too young to understand what was happening. But Manu was not ordinary, and her marriage was not ordinary. She became the wife of the Maharaja of Jhansi, a small princely state in north-central India. Suddenly, she wasn't just the daughter of a court official. She was queen, not in name only. Her husband saw in her what others had not yet fully realized: strength, judgment, vision. They renamed her Lakshmi Bai, a name drawn from the goddess of prosperity, and maybe it was fitting. But it wasn't wealth she was born to carry, it was fire. She did not disappear into the royal palace. She didn't spend her days in silks behind carved screens. She still rode horses. She still read books. She started asking questions. And when her husband fell ill years later, she started giving answers. No one teaches you how to become a symbol. No one gives you a guidebook on how to turn personal tragedy into political fire. But that's what she would soon have to do. Not yet, but the winds were already shifting. At this point in the story, she hadn't picked up a sword in war. She hadn't faced down a British general. She hadn't lost a child or stood alone at the edge of a collapsing empire. She was still a young woman in Jhansi, newly titled, newly married. But the fire was there. It burned quietly. And if you were British, and you walked past her balcony, you might have seen just another queen, another girl in silk. You would have been wrong. She was still young, barely a teenager, when she was married off. It was not uncommon. In 19th century India, marriage arrived early, often without fanfare. One day, you were someone's daughter. The next, someone's wife. Manikarnika, now renamed Lakshmi Bai, became the queen of Jhansi. Jhansi was not a kingdom of great wealth or enormous land. It wasn't a capital of empires or a name that echoed through continents. It was small, set in the folds of central India, surrounded by hills, forests, and dust. But in those quiet streets and palace walls, history was already whispering. Her husband, Maharaja Gangadhar Rao, was older, educated, cultured, a man who cared about literature, reform, and legacy. He wore pearls, but he carried the weight of a kingdom that had seen better days. He had lost his first wife, and now he was marrying again, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of duty. But Lakshmibai was not what people expected in a queen. She did not take to luxury easily. She was polite, yes, graceful even, but there was steel under the silk. She asked questions. She read laws. She observed ministers. She walked the palace not like a guest, but like someone preparing to build something, or protect something. Still, she loved. Not in the way stories often exaggerate, not with poems or balcony sighs, but with commitment, with curiosity. She sat beside her husband during court meetings. She learned. She listened. He trusted her, not just as a companion, but as a mind. Years passed, quietly. Outside Jhansi, things were less quiet. The British East India Company was growing stronger, swallowing smaller kingdoms like drops of ink in water. Its policies were efficient, often ruthless. One in particular would one day reach Lakshmibai's doorstep. It was called the Doctrine of Lapse. According to it, if a king died without a biological son, the British had the right to absorb that kingdom into their empire. But that was not yet. That storm was still beyond the hills. For now, she tried to build a family. She and the Maharaja hoped for a child. Jhansi hoped too. A baby meant continuity. It meant stability. It meant that Jhansi would remain Jhansi. But fate does not listen to hope. The child came and did not survive. The grief was quiet, private. No royal decrees were made. No tears in public. But something shifted. In her. In the Maharaja. In the palace heir. They adopted a son, a distant relative of the king, naming him Damodar Rao. In every way that mattered, he was their child. The Maharaja wrote letters, signed declarations, formally naming the boy heir. He even requested that the British honour the adoption after his death. He died not long after. Lakshmibai wore white. She sat still, but the silence was deceiving. She was now a widow. In most places in India, that meant retreat, disappearance, a life of shadows. But she did not disappear. She stood at court. She argued. She negotiated. She sent messages. She asked that the child be recognized, that the promise be kept, that Jhansi be left alone. The reply came, eventually. It was short, polite, and final. The British rejected the adoption. According to them, Damodar was not a legal heir. According to them, Jhansi no longer had a ruler. According to them, the state would be annexed. Her answer was brief. I shall not give up my Jhansi. Those were the words. Quiet, measured. But behind them stood a history of training, of loss, of growing fires. The girl who once rode horses now stood at the edge of empire, between a foreign army and the dust-covered gates of her kingdom. The marriage that had begun as a political alliance had become something far more difficult to describe. It had made her queen, but it had also made her ready. In rooms where men discussed borders, she had listened. In meetings where rulers signed decrees, she had watched. She knew what power looked like, and how it slipped. She had worn a crown. Now she would wear armor. But not yet. In the quiet days after her husband's death, she still rose early, still prayed, still trained, still sat with her child. The palace had grown colder, but she walked its corridors like a flame that refused to go out. History likes to pretend that revolutions start with fire. Sometimes, they start with silence, and a single woman refusing to surrender. Grief doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it enters like dust through a window, quiet, unnoticed, until everything is covered. After the Maharaja's death, the palace of Jhansi grew silent. The rooms were the same. The courtyard still caught the morning light. The same flowers still bloomed in the gardens. But Lakshmibai was different now. She dressed in white, not just for ritual, but because it reminded her not to forget. In public, she stood straight, composed, a queen, but behind the curtain, the weight of it all sat heavily. The child she had adopted, Damodar Rao, was young, unaware of the politics swirling around him. She held him in her lap, told him stories, traced small circles on his back while trying to silence the ones spinning in her own mind. Widowhood in India was often a social exile, but Lakshmibai refused to vanish. She stayed in court. She continued to meet with advisors. She still read the news that arrived from Calcutta and London. And more, the news was not comforting. Because while she mourned, others planned. The British East India Company, always efficient, had not forgotten about Jhansi. They had been watching, and now that the king was gone, they were ready to act. The doctrine of lapse was clear. No biological heir, no sovereign kingdom. Adoption, in their view, did not count. Never mind the king's wishes, never mind the queen's leadership, never mind the child. Jhansi, they said, would now be annexed. Politely, of course, legally, professionally, with forms and letters and British signatures in black ink. But to Lakshmibai, it didn't matter how it was done. It was still theft. At first, she responded with diplomacy. She wrote letters. She sent envoys. She asked for reconsideration. The request was simple. Honor the king's wishes. Recognize the child. Let the kingdom stand. No, came the reply. The ink on the rejection had barely dried before rumours began swirling. The British planned to take over the fort. Jhansi would soon be under company rule. British troops would be stationed in the palace. The court would be dissolved. The queen would be relocated. It was not just politics. It was erasure. And yet, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream or rally or march. Not yet. She simply gathered her people. She looked at the map. She walked the walls of the fort she had called home for years and counted how many muskets they had. She asked how much food was in storage. She checked the wells. War had not yet arrived, but it was close. You could feel it in the way the guards stood straighter, in the way merchants packed more quietly at the bazaar, in the way the city stopped saying the word annexation out loud. She began training again, formally now. Archery, swordplay, horsemanship, not alone, with soldiers, with women, with young volunteers who had never held weapons before but knew what was coming. To the outside world, she was still a queen in mourning, but inside Jhansi, something older had awakened. Not anger, not vengeance, but something sharper, clarity. She saw what many refused to see, that there would be no negotiation, no compromise, that a woman defending a crown wasn't going to be given the same respect as a man expanding one, that Jhansi wasn't simply being taken, it was being dismissed. And that was something she could not allow. So, she waited. She watched the roads. She counted the days. She tightened the city gates. And when British officers arrived to make their claim, she met them not in mourning, but in armour. She didn't raise her sword. Not yet. But she didn't bow either. And in that moment, without bloodshed, without battle cries, a quiet decision was made. She would not give up Jhansi, not to paperwork, not to empire, not without a fight. History would remember the war. But the war began here, in silence, in grief, in a queen walking the ramparts of her city, alone, but unafraid. In most stories, transformation is dramatic. It happens in a storm, with thunder, with shouting. But in Jhansi, it happened softly, almost quietly. She rose one morning, earlier than usual. The sky was grey. There was no ceremony, no proclamation. Just Lakshmibai, standing alone in the palace courtyard, dressed not in white silk but in dark cotton, wrapped tightly at the waist, not mourning anymore, preparing. Widowhood had been expected of her. Silence had been expected of her. But she was not interested in expectation. She was interested in survival. And not just hers. By now, the people of Jhansi had begun to notice. The palace guards no longer stood as decoration. They were training again. The city gates were reinforced. The watchtowers manned at night. In the kitchens of the palace, women were boiling rice, but also melting metal, for bullets, for blades. Lakshmibai walked among them. She gave orders, yes, but more than that, she listened. She stood beside blacksmiths as they shaped crude weapons. She stood beside mothers as they sewed sandbags and stacked grain. She rode through the town on horseback, inspecting the defences, not above the people, but among them. Jhansi was not just her home, it was her oath. She had made it quietly, not to an army, not to a king, but to the land itself, to the red soil that stained her feet as a child. to the banyan trees that had shaded her books, to the narrow streets where children still played, unaware of the cannons being polished at the city's edge. The oath was simple. If Jhansi must fall, it will fall over my body. She didn't write it down. She didn't shout it from the walls, but it spread, whispered, passed from soldier to cook, to priest, to orphan. Not everyone believed they could win, but most believed she wouldn't run, and that was enough to stay. Still, she knew what she was up against. The British were not merchants anymore. They were commanders, bureaucrats, generals. They had experience, rifles, logistics, reinforcements and time, and they had no interest in debate. They would come with flags and horses and muskets, and they would expect surrender. But Lakshmibai was no longer the girl in the courtyard. She trained harder, longer. She learned formations, studied flanking tactics. She asked her advisors, not for tradition, but for efficiency. She met with local leaders, even those who had once questioned her right to rule, and she spoke not as a queen, but as a guardian. The fort was turned into a bastion. Cannons were mounted, watch schedules drawn. The treasury was counted, divided, rationed. It was not glamorous. It was not glorious. It was logistics, and through it all, she remained visible. Always in the city, always in the fort, never hidden. She did not sleep much, but when she did, she slept in armor. This was not metaphor. She truly wore it, polished, fitted, practical, her sword never far, her horse ready. The people began to call her something different now, not queen, but leader. Some even whispered, warrior. She didn't correct them, because slowly, she was becoming both. This was no rebellion of chaos, no last-minute resistance. This was measured, disciplined. It was not about ego. It was about soil. When the first British scouts appeared near the outskirts of Jhansi, they did not find a city in mourning. They found a fortress. They found soldiers with steady hands. And at the gate, they found a woman on horseback, back straight, sword at her side, eyes calm. She didn't speak first. She didn't need to. Her presence said what words could not. I am still here. We are still here. And when the scouts rode back, the message was clear. This would not be easy. And perhaps, they thought, perhaps this queen would surrender before blood was spilled. They didn't know her. They didn't know that the widow had already buried fear, that her grief had already turned to resolve, that this city, this cracked, quiet, sunburnt piece of land, was not just under her rule, it was under her protection. And she had no plans to let it go. It began without much ceremony. One morning the sound of distant drums reached the outer edges of Jhansi. Birds scattered. Smoke trails rose in the horizon, like threads being pulled across the sky. The British forces had arrived. They were not shouting. They did not charge. They set up camps first, measured the distance from their cannons to the fort walls, calculated angles, timed the wind. And then they waited. So did she. For weeks, Jhansi held its breath. Inside the fort, the preparations were complete. The gates were sealed. The rations counted. Every man, woman and child knew their role. Some cooked, some carried water, some sharpened blades, and some stood with rifles that shook in their hands. Above them all, Lakshmibai rode the walls daily, not with a parade, no grand display, just her and her horse, quiet and alert, eyes moving across the landscape like a clock, ticking. The first cannonball struck just before dawn. It didn't hit anything vital. It cracked a corner of the north wall, but it was loud enough to wake the city. Children cried. Pots fell. A dog howled. And still she did not flinch. She simply adjusted her strategy, sent more guards to the north tower, ordered repairs, reassigned the watch. She gave orders with the calm of someone arranging furniture, not because it was unimportant, but because panic had no place here. Over the next days, the siege intensified. Cannons thundered every morning. Muskets flashed in the night. British troops dug trenches closer and closer to the city, the air filled with ash and iron. Yet inside the fort, life continued, mechanical, determined. People slept in shifts, ate in silence, carried wounded without crying out. Jhansi did not roar. It endured. Lakshmibai, always visible, became more than a queen. She became a signal. She slept little, rode often, spoke to commanders by torchlight, checked walls herself. She bled once. An arrow grazed her shoulder, but didn't pause. She wrapped the wound and kept walking. Those who saw her said she moved like someone who had already accepted death and decided not to offer it an easy victory. She wasn't reckless. She was methodical. Every counterattack was planned, every sally measured, every word spoken carefully. But the siege dragged on. The British brought more men, more artillery. They breached a side gate. A fire broke out in the market district. Grain stores dwindled. Water turned bitter. Still, she refused to surrender. Even when her advisors begged, even when allies sent no reinforcements, even when messages stopped coming, she stood at the top of the palace steps, helmet under her arm, and said only, "We are not finished." She could have escaped. There were tunnels, secret passages. Some told her to go, to survive, to lead from outside. She didn't, because Jhansi had become more than a city. It was her child, her husband, her oath, her proof. And when she rode into the heart of the battlefield, sword raised, sari tied high, rifle across her back, soldiers on both sides paused. Because it was not every day you saw a woman leading a charge through smoke and rubble, not with speeches, just with presence. She didn't shout, she didn't weep, she just rode, her horse hooves hitting stone like war drums, and where she pointed, her troops followed. The battle did not turn. The odds were never in her favor, but she changed something deeper, something slower. She rewrote the silence. Because Jhansi did not fall in shame. It did not crumble quietly under foreign boots. It burned. It howled. It fought. And at the center of it was a woman, wearing armor, covered in ash, standing where no one expected her to stand. When the walls finally gave way, when the cannons stopped because there was nothing left to shoot, the British found no surrender waiting. They found smouldering stone. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the smoke, they heard hooves. She was gone. Not captured, not killed, not erased, just gone. Because a queen doesn't always die with her castle. Sometimes she rides through fire and keeps going. Victory was never promised, but she hadn't expected to be left behind. In the early days of resistance, messengers came with promises. Letters arrived sealed with wax and pride. Regional rulers had written their names with bold strokes, pledging men weapons, grain. Rebellion, it seemed, would not be lonely. But promises made in peace are easy. Promises kept in war are rare. As the siege of Jhansi dragged on, the letters stopped. The reinforcements didn't arrive. The names that once rang loudly in her court faded into silence. One by one, the allies she had counted on turned away, not with betrayal, but with absence. Some bowed to British pressure. Others calculated their chances and found her too bold, too stubborn, too dangerous to follow. A few meant to help, but never made it. The British had cut roads, monitored passes, seized horses, intercepted plans. In the end, she stood nearly alone. Not in spirit. The people of Jhansi remained, but politically, militarily, she was isolated, and she knew it. Still, she did not curse them. Not out loud, maybe not even inwardly, because she understood something that most leaders learn too late. People are not always brave at the same time. She simply adjusted. She shortened her messages, sent fewer scouts, relied less on hope, more on what she could see and count with her own hands. And every evening she walked the ramparts alone, not always to inspect, sometimes just to breathe. The city below her was tired. The fires burned low. Children slept two to a mat. Old men sharpened tools that would not stop bullets. The priests whispered prayers they hadn't spoken in years. But she walked, because if she didn't, fear might take root. Not just in others, in herself. The top of the fort was windier than expected. From there, she could see beyond the siege lines, distant trees, empty hills, the roads where help was supposed to come, and didn't. She never cried on the ramparts. She didn't sigh loudly. She just stood still, like a flag without fabric, held up by memory. There were moments she must have doubted, but she never surrendered to doubt. That was the difference. Inside the palace, she still ate sparingly, trained daily, visited the injured, She still kissed her adopted son on the forehead each night. She still kept her armor clean, her blade sharp, her mind sharper. Her generals whispered. Some wanted to open the gates. Others wanted to flee. A few, quietly, prepared to switch sides. She saw it all. She noted it. But she didn't panic. Because even without allies, she still had a choice. And she had already made it. When a messenger returned breathless one afternoon, reporting that a neighboring prince, once a friend, had declared neutrality, she said only, "Then we'll fight without him." No speech, no anger, just that. Because at this point, she wasn't defending Jhansi for politics. She wasn't holding the line because it was expected of her. She was doing it because the city was still standing, and as long as it stood, she would. The British, for their part, noticed the isolation. They began to press harder, moved their troops closer, fired longer. They thought she would break. A woman alone, no allies, dwindling food, no real hope of victory. Why would she continue? They didn't understand. They were still measuring her by typical rulers, by kings who surrendered for treaties, generals who bargained for comfort. They didn't know what she had already buried. A husband, a future, a name, an identity. She had nothing left to lose, and people with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous. When the final wall cracked and the fire reached the temple steps, when the British shouted that surrender would bring mercy, she didn't reply. Instead, she saddled her horse, strapped her son to her back, and vanished. No torchlight, no trumpet, only hoofbeats. History would call it a retreat, but sometimes survival is a form of defiance. And escape, a kind of battle cry. When cities fall, they usually fall with noise. There are gates broken open, flags pulled down, orders shouted, fires lit without permission, people running, not always sure where. History tends to record this as chaos, but Lakshmibai's escape wasn't chaos. It was quiet, methodical, focused. The British believed she would stay until the end, until the flag burned, or the palace crumbled, or the soldiers fell around her feet. They believed her courage was fixed in one place. They did not expect movement. They certainly did not expect flight. But courage does not always stand still. Sometimes it rides. The night before her escape, the city burned. Fires crept through warehouses. Cannons rested for once, exhausted. The air was thick with smoke. Somewhere beyond the haze, British troops were preparing to storm the main gate. Inside, Jhansi had already begun to mourn itself. But in one room, behind thick stone walls, Lakshmibai tightened the straps of her saddle. She did not speak much. She gave few instructions. The plan was simple. Break through the eastern perimeter before dawn. Ride fast. Do not stop. And whatever happens, protect the child. The child, Damodar Rao, her adopted son, her last family, her only heir. He was small, barely able to speak full sentences, but old enough to hold on. Old enough to understand that something very big and very bad was happening. She tied him to her back with strips of cloth, not silk, not velvet, just strong cotton soaked in water, so it would not burn easily. When she mounted her horse, the others paused. She didn't look like a queen. Not in that moment. She looked like a figure from a dream, her sari tucked like armor, her face smeared with soot, her eyes sharp, but tired. She carried a sword, not to strike, but to clear the way if needed. There were others with her, loyal guards, a few commanders, some who had served her for years, but all of them knew this was not a march. It was a dash, a thread through a needle's eye. When the gates opened, there was no roar, just hooves. The British did not see them at first. The smoke helped. The noise of the city collapsing gave cover. But once spotted, shouts rang out. Shots followed. A few horses fell. A few men cried out. But she did not stop. She rode faster than anyone thought possible. Not wildly, but with strange calm, as if she were threading through memory, not battle. As if her body knew every curve of the land and every risk ahead. Behind her, the city cracked. Ahead of her, hills rose like questions. The child said nothing. He pressed into her spine, his small arms gripping as tightly as he could. Every breath she took, he felt. Every turn the horse made, he absorbed. They reached the tree line before dawn. The British searched. They shouted. They sent scouts. But she was already gone. Into the forest. Into the hills. Into the part of the map marked only by guesses. The ride became legend. Not because it was the longest or the fastest or the most violent, but because of what it represented. A woman. A queen. Carrying the future of her dynasty on her back. Literally. While riding away from a city in flames. Most rulers would have stayed and died. Most mothers would have fled earlier. Most people, in her position, would have broken somewhere along the way. But she didn't, because this was not surrender. This was strategy. She knew Jhansi was lost, but Damodar was not, and the story wasn't over. In the forests beyond the battlefield, she found shelter. Supporters in nearby regions gave food, water, rest. Not because they were ordered, but because they had heard what she'd done. The rumors moved faster than she had. "Did you hear?" they whispered. She rode out with the boy on her back. She didn't fall. She escaped. She's still fighting. She didn't correct them, because in a way, it was all true. Jhansi was in ruins, but she was not, and neither was the dream she carried. It was small, wrapped in cloth, clinging to her back, and still alive. After the escape from Jhansi, the road did not end. It simply changed. The queen who had ridden through fire did not rest long. The forests gave her shelter. Villagers gave her food. But she was not looking for peace. She was looking for the next place to stand. That place was Gwalior, a large fortress city. Gwalior had long been a jewel in the geography of central India. Its sandstone walls rose like cliffs. Its inner chambers had echoed with royal footsteps for centuries. But now, it was caught in the storm. Multiple forces wanted control of it. Rebel leaders, local rulers, and the British. The city stood like a chess piece on a burning board. Lakshmi Bai arrived not as a refugee, but as a commander. Her reputation had already arrived before her. Whispers of the woman who had ridden through siege lines with a child tied to her back. She no longer needed to introduce herself. In Gwalior, she was not met with doubt, but with opportunity. The rebel forces welcomed her, some hesitantly, some gratefully. They needed her not just for strategy, but for morale. Wherever she stood, others seemed more willing to hold their ground. She helped organize troops, inspected artillery, drafted defense lines. She rode the fortress walls as she had done in Jhansi, but this time with a sharper edge. She knew now how quickly allies could vanish, how fire spread, how cities fell. This was her final stand, though no one said it out loud. The British, learning she was in Gwalior, moved fast. They sent reinforcements, columns of redcoats, more cannons, more horses. The sky filled with dust, and the ground shook under marching feet. There was no longer time to hope, only time to fight. The battle came with the morning heat. It started with distant gunfire, short bursts, followed by silence, then more, then louder, then the cannons. Again, always the cannons. Echoing through valleys, bouncing off the thick stone of Gwalior's fortress walls. Lakshmi Bai did not hide in the inner court. She mounted her horse as always, armor strapped tight, sword ready, rifle across her saddle. Damodar, her son, left behind in safety this time. She did not give speeches. She gave orders. She led cavalry charges down narrow slopes. She moved between squads like smoke, directing, adjusting, pushing back. Her voice, steady. Her posture, unshaken. Her presence, unmissable. But the British were too many. And this time, there were no thick fortress walls between her and them. She was struck during one of the charges. Not dramatically, not with a thunderous blow, just a bullet, silent, fast, cold. It tore through her side. She did not fall immediately. She kept riding, for minutes, maybe more. No one is quite sure how long. When she did fall, it was near a temple, not far from the battlefield, a place of stone and dust. Witnesses say she asked not to be captured, not to be taken by the British, dead or alive. Some say her body was cremated quickly by loyalists. Others say it vanished. No grave was marked. No funeral was recorded. She disappeared into the smoke she had ridden through so many times before. The British eventually entered Gwalior. They claimed victory, took stock, counted weapons, drew up reports. But what they didn't capture was the story. Because while they stood among broken walls and scattered ammunition, the name Lakshmi Bai was already growing beyond them. The woman who defied empire, the queen who led from the front, the mother who carried a child through cannon fire, the fighter who never begged. She had lost, and yet she had become something more dangerous than a general. She had become a symbol, not because of how many battles she fought, but because she never fought for herself. She fought for a city, for a child, for a land, for the belief that courage didn't require permission. In the days that followed, her enemies called her brave, but her people already called her something else. She died without ceremony. No royal procession, no marble tomb, no slow-burning funeral pyre watched by weeping nobles, no inscription carved in stone. When Lakshmi Bai fell at Gwalior, the land that had once echoed with her horse's gallop fell silent. The British marked her death in reports. Brief, clinical, distant. Some spelled her name wrong. Some couldn't decide whether to label her rebel or commander. But in the streets of India, her name did not vanish. It moved softly, through whispers, through stories, through lullabies. In a small village near Jhansi, an old woman told a group of children about the queen, who rode with a sword in one hand and a child on her back. She didn't use dates. She didn't quote documents. She just said, she didn't run. She rode. In a dusty market square, a man sang an old folk song about a warrior in a red sari who fought soldiers and vanished into fire. People paused. They hummed along. They nodded, not because they remembered the facts, but because they remembered the feeling. And sometimes, that's all it takes. You might think that history belongs to those who write it, but sometimes it belongs to those who remember it quietly, not with statues, not with books, but with breath. Lakshmi Bai became breath. She was spoken about in kitchens, behind curtains, between mothers and daughters. In every story told to a girl who was told she couldn't, she was there, not as a ghost. As a possibility, they said she was fierce, that she never smiled in court, that her eyes were sharp like steel, and her voice low like thunder before the storm. But they also said she laughed like a child when she played with her son, that she whispered prayers before battle, that she loved the taste of guava and the smell of sandalwood. They said she could have surrendered, that the British offered her a way out, that all she had to do was kneel, but she didn't, and even those who didn't know the whole story remembered that one part. She didn't kneel. It was enough. In the years that followed her death, statues did come. Eventually, bronze and stone. Her name was carved into textbooks. Her story was told on stages, her image painted on school walls. But these came later. Long before that, she was already alive, in memory, and unlike stone, memory breathes. It bends and shifts and glows a little brighter when needed. When people felt powerless, they reached for her story. When girls were told to be quiet, someone mentioned her name. When freedom seemed like a myth, she became proof that someone, somewhere, had once fought without permission. The British Empire, rigid, wealthy, global, had underestimated that. They had won the battle, taken the fort, ended the rebellion, written their reports. But what they couldn't erase was the image of a queen on horseback, sari flying, sword raised, child held close. Because that image didn't belong to them. It belonged to the people. It belonged to the girl in the village with a stick for a sword, to the boy tracing maps in the dirt, to the mother who whispered to her daughter at night, "Be strong like her." Over time, the world moved on. Empires rose and fell. Flags changed. Streets were renamed. History books grew heavier. But her legend stayed light. You could carry it in a sentence. You could pass it in a song. You could tuck it into a bedtime story without needing a footnote. She was the queen who didn't give up, and that was enough. Even now, if you walk through the old city of Jhansi, you might hear it. Not loudly, but gently, like the sound of hooves on stone that never quite fade, a whisper of fabric in the wind, the feeling that someone once stood where you're standing and refused to be moved. No trumpet was blown when she died, but her name echoes louder than one ever could. She didn't ask for statues, she didn't need them, because long before bronze, there was memory. And long after bronze fades, there still will be. Rani Lakshmi Bai did not set out to become a legend. She did not write manifestos or plan revolutions in secret rooms. She lived as many do, through duty, through loss, through change. And yet, somewhere along the way, she became something more. Not because she won. She didn't. Not because she conquered lands or built monuments. She didn't. But because, when the moment came to choose, between silence and resistance, between escape and defiance, she chose to stand. She stood when her city crumbled. She stood when her allies disappeared. She stood when the world insisted she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, and she stood not with pride, but with purpose. In a time when widows were meant to vanish behind veils, she rode into battle. In a world ruled by empire, she ruled her own fate, if only for a short while. In a country divided by fear, she showed what courage looked like. She carried no royal entourage. She wore no crown in the field. What she carried was heavier, a child, a sword, and the memory of everything she had lost. And she still moved forward. Many have tried to define her, a patriot, a rebel, a martyr, a queen. But perhaps she was simply a woman who refused to surrender to the idea that power belonged to someone else. Her life was not long, her kingdom was not large, but her example, quiet, relentless, burning like an ember, outlived them both. And maybe that's the point, that strength isn't always loud, that bravery doesn't always come with music or medals. Sometimes, it's just a hand holding the reins, a heartbeat steady under armor, a woman deciding not to run. If you had lived in her time, you might not have lasted a day. The dust, the fire, the decisions that could crush you. You might have watched from behind walls, or fled when the gates broke, or doubted her until the very end. But she didn't. She stayed. And because she did, we still speak her name. Not because history demands it, but because it deserves it. She wasn't a princess, not a high priestess in Karnak, or a favored consort of some mighty pharaoh. She left behind no statues, no golden tomb, not even a proper mention in the scrolls of history. All she gave us was a shard of clay and a name. It was found buried beneath layers of time in the ruins of an old kiln near the Nile. To most eyes, it looked unremarkable, just a broken corner of a bowl, reddish-brown and chipped from centuries of silence. But near the edge, etched in faint lines by hand, was something rare. A name, not that of a nobleman, not a royal decree, but the name of a woman. A potter, unknown, unrecorded, uncelebrated, yet she did something few women of her time ever dared. She signed her work. We don't know who she was. Maybe the daughter of a kiln master, maybe an apprentice, maybe just someone bold enough to claim what she'd shaped with her own hands. But one thing is certain, she lived. She molded wet earth in the dry heat of an ancient Egyptian morning. She knew the weight of clay, the burn of the furnace, and the dull ache of long hours under the desert sun. For thousands of years, she remained silent. No story, no name in history books. She was lost, swallowed by sand and time, until now. Until this little fragment surfaced, like a pebble rising from the bed of a slow, forgotten river. Not everyone is born to write history. Not everyone wears a crown or commands legions. But sometimes, it only takes a name, scratched softly into a clay bowl, to remind us there was someone here, a woman, a life, and perhaps a quiet dream. She wasn't meant to be remembered. Not like this. The world she lived in, ancient, sun-bleached Egypt, had a place for powerful women, sure, queens, priestesses, royal daughters with painted eyes and ceremonial gold. Their names were carved into temple walls, etched into stone to last forever. But not hers. She wasn't royalty. She didn't walk through palace corridors or whisper into the ears of gods. She worked with clay, with hands, not prayers, with sweat, not ceremony. We don't know her face, but we know what she touched. And sometimes, that's more intimate than a portrait. If you close your eyes, you can almost picture it. The workshop was likely no bigger than a cottage, tucked near the edge of a riverbank where reeds swayed in slow winds. The air heavy with dust, the scent of wet earth and old fire clinging to every breath. Kilns burning all day, their heat pouring into the room like a second sun. Children running between pots, water jars lined in rows. Her hands, stained with ochre and sand. her hair tied back in a way that made her forehead shine with sweat by mid-morning. That was her temple. That was her court. She might have started as a helper, hauling clay, fetching water, cleaning the soot from the bottoms of fired bowls. She would have watched others, mostly men, shape the earth with practiced grace, spinning the wheel, pulling the vessel tall with fingers trained to know just when to press, when to ease. But clay is democratic. It listens to any hand that's patient. And perhaps one day, when no one was looking, she took a lump for herself. Maybe it was small, a dish, a lamp, something simple. Maybe she shaped it by the river, humming to herself. Maybe she ruined it the first time. Or maybe not. Maybe she was good from the start. Maybe she made things so beautiful someone noticed. We like to think of ancient Egypt as a land of power and order, where people moved only in ranks and rituals. But in workshops like hers, the rules were softer, practical. If someone could do the work, really do it, they got to keep doing it. So perhaps she wasn't the only woman in the workshop. Perhaps there were others, silent, capable, invisible. But she did something they didn't. She signed her name. Maybe that wasn't even allowed. Maybe she waited until the master turned away, then scratched the characters quickly, just under the rim of the bowl. A little rebellion, small as a breath. A secret only she knew. Or maybe the master didn't care. Maybe he looked the other way because her work sold well. People drank from her cups, not knowing who had made them. It's tempting to imagine her proud, sitting near the kiln, rubbing her cracked hands together as smoke drifted up into the dusk, watching the fire paint her pot with permanence. But pride is dangerous in places like that. She might have smiled, but not for long. There were rules in her world, about gender, about ownership, about silence. Still, the signature stayed, long after the pot broke, long after the roof of the workshop collapsed, long after kingdoms rose and crumbled, and sand filled every crevice. Her name survived. Not shouted, just there, etched. It wasn't a name like Nefertiti. It didn't echo in temple hymns. It didn't come with dynasties or dramas, but it was real. It was hers, and that changes everything. Because now we see her not as a shadow under history's grand stage, but as someone alive, someone tired at the end of a day, someone who stretched her back after hours, hunched over a wheel, someone who maybe traded a pot for bread, who maybe had a baby crying in the corner of the shop, who maybe told stories while she worked, stories no one wrote down. We don't know what her life was, but we know it mattered, because she knew it mattered. She said so, with a name. You could spend your life studying pharaohs and never get close to them. But one woman with dirt under her nails, a voice no one expected to hear, carved herself into our memory, not by accident, not by miracle, but by choice. And now, centuries later, we find her not in a golden tomb, but in a museum drawer. A little piece of pottery, catalogued and boxed, labelled in pencil, forgotten again, until someone picks it up, notices the marks, and asks, who was she? Not a queen, not a priestess, just a woman who made something, and dared to say, I was here. When we think of ancient civilizations, especially ones that built pyramids and worshipped sun gods, we tend to imagine stiff hierarchies. A world where men ruled, fought, recorded, and left their names for us to memorize. Women, they're usually in the background, barefoot, quiet, veiled in mystery or myth. But Egypt wasn't quite like that, at least, not entirely. This woman, our potter, our forgotten name etched into clay, wasn't alone in making her mark. She was part of a world that, for all its age, may surprise you with how it saw women. Not always equal, no, but not invisible either. Let's begin with a truth that feels strange for its time. Women in ancient Egypt could own property, land, livestock, businesses, even slaves if they were wealthy, not just through inheritance, but as individuals. They could buy and sell in the market, take legal action, write contracts. A woman's legal identity wasn't absorbed by her husband's. She remained her own person in the eyes of the law. There are documents from over 30 years ago that record women hiring scribes to write contracts on their behalf, women suing other women, women divorcing their husbands and taking the dowry with them when they left. No guardianship, no need to ask permission. just her name, her voice, her choice. It's radical when you remember that even in some parts of the modern world, this wasn't always the case until the 20th century. Now, this didn't mean ancient Egypt was a feminist utopia. Far from it. Power, political and religious, was still held by men. Pharaohs were almost always male. High priests, generals, scribes, all mostly male domains. Women who rose to rule, like Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, were seen as extraordinary exceptions, often forced to dress, act, or speak like men to be taken seriously. And among commoners, the potters, the bakers, the weavers, daily life was hard, physical, repetitive. Women worked in homes, in fields, in workshops. They were vital to the economy, but rarely glorified in records. Their labor was everywhere, and their names almost nowhere. Almost, but not quite. Because every now and then, a name survives, like a whisper, like a breath against the centuries. And when we find it, like the one on our potter's bowl, it reminds us that beneath all the rituals and monuments, there were individuals, people, women, who knew what they were worth. Some were housekeepers, some were merchants, some brewed beer, a respected job, especially among women. Some were dancers, singers, midwives, textile workers. There's evidence that women ran shops and inns, that they travelled for trade, that they taught their daughters skills to earn their own coin. And yes, some shaped clay. There's even a story of a woman named Naunakti from around 1140 BCE who left behind a legal will, not her husband's will, hers. In it, she divides her property among her children, praising some, disowning others. Her words are clear and unflinching. She had agency, she had assets, she had opinions. So what does this mean for our potter? It means her life, though hard, wasn't necessarily silent. It means she may have learned her craft from her mother, or taught it to a niece. It means that her signature wasn't a miracle. It was a decision. Bold, yes, but not impossible, and perhaps not even rare, just rarely preserved. Because history is brutal to the quiet. Ink fades, clay shatters, stories get buried, and the farther you stand from power, the more likely you are to vanish in the pages of time. But not always. What's striking is that Egyptian women were represented in art with surprising balance. Tomb paintings show husbands and wives dining together, standing side by side. They're shown making offerings, singing, even playing board games. You don't see that in many other ancient cultures. They were wives, yes, but also partners, and sometimes competitors. It's easy to romanticize this, to turn it into some progressive fairy tale. But let's be careful. Life was still bound by class, birth, expectation. A poor woman had fewer choices than a noble one. A widow with children likely had to marry again or face hardship. And for many, the grind of daily survival left little time for art, rebellion, or even reflection. But it would be wrong to assume they were powerless. They navigated, negotiated, endured. They left behind not only children, but craft, not only labor, but marks, names, evidence. So maybe our potter wasn't an iconoclast. Maybe she wasn't defiant or revolutionary. Maybe she was simply a woman who had learned something well, and for one moment wanted the world to know she'd made it, that this bowl, this plate, this humble thing was hers. It doesn't matter that she wasn't a queen. It doesn't matter that temples didn't sing her name. What matters is that, for 1 second in a dusty workshop, she picked up a stylus or a stick, looked at what she'd made, and decided it was worth remembering, that she was worth remembering. And then she scratched her name into clay, not to challenge the pharaoh, not to outshine the gods, just to exist, visibly, tangibly, briefly. And isn't that what we all want? You've probably seen it in the movies. A potter, sleeves rolled up, sunlight pouring through an open window, hands wet with clay, spinning the wheel with slow grace, shaping a perfect bowl while soft music plays in the background. Maybe there's even a romantic partner nearby, smiling, watching, clean, poetic, gentle. That's not how it was. Not for her, not in ancient Egypt. For our potter, the day didn't begin with a muse or a melody. It began with heat, with sweat, with dust in the back of her throat. She probably woke up before the sun did, the Nile still dark, the world still quiet, save for dogs barking and chickens starting to stir. If she was lucky, she had a little bread left from the day before. Maybe a fig. Maybe not. There wasn't time for much. The kiln wouldn't wait. Her hands were already calloused from yesterday. Cracks along her knuckles, dirt under her fingernails that never fully scrubbed out. No gloves, no protection, just skin against sand. The workshop was not a studio. It was more like a shed. Mud brick walls, a packed earth floor, no windows, maybe a hole in the roof to let the smoke out, no fans, no breeze. The fire from the kiln didn't just stay in the corner, it soaked the room. And that wheel? It wasn't electric, smooth or balanced. It was likely a heavy stone disc, spun by foot or hand, often unsteady. Making it turn at the right speed was a skill on its own. Too fast, and the clay flew apart. Too slow, and it collapsed under its own weight. She would have leaned forward, elbows tight, back aching, as she tried to center the lump of earth in front of her. Centering clay sounds easy. It isn't. It fights you. It wobbles, slips, pushes back. You push it down, pull it up, push it down again, all while spinning it steadily. Your whole body tenses, your breath slows, your hands have to feel everything. The thickness, the wetness, the balance. One wrong move, and the whole piece folds into itself. Start again. And clay wasn't always perfect. It had stones in it, bits of dried grass. Sometimes it was too wet, sometimes too dry. She didn't get to choose the quality. She worked with what she had. That's what the poor do. Make beauty out of what's left behind. After shaping came the drying. Not indoors on pretty shelves, but outside under a brutal sun. Flies buzzing. Chickens curious. One gust of wind, and the dust ruined the surface. One careless child or goat could knock it all over. Then came the firing. The kiln wasn't a sleek gas oven. It was a primitive furnace, made of mud brick and ash. It had to be fed constantly. Wood, straw, whatever they could burn. Heat control? Forget it. The whole thing could get too hot and crack the pots, or not hot enough and leave them brittle. She probably had scars on her arms from reaching in too early, and burns that never fully healed. Still, she waited, watching, eyes red from smoke, hoping the bowl wouldn't shatter like last time. When the pieces came out whole, she might have smiled. A quiet smile. No applause. No customers lining up to admire her artistry. Just survival. Another bowl to trade. Another jar to carry water. Another lamp to hold oil. People didn't buy her pottery to display it. They used it. And then they broke it. Dropped on stone floors. Cracked in the fire. Tossed in trash heaps. Her work wasn't immortal. It wasn't sacred. It was ordinary. Practical. Disposable. But that didn't make it meaningless. Because every bowl she made kept a home fed. Every lamp she shaped lit someone's prayers. Every jug she molded carried water across sand. Her fingers were on everything, even if her name wasn't. And then, just once, she scratched her name. Into one bowl, maybe two, not to be famous, just to be real. The irony? That's the bowl we found, not the hundreds she made before. Not the thousands that broke, the one with her name. That's the one that lasted. We romanticize craftsmanship now. We celebrate handmade. We pay more for imperfections. But back then, handmade wasn't luxury. It was labor. Endless, repetitive, unsung. Her back hurt. Her eyes burned. Her feet were swollen from standing all day. And still, she worked. Because no one else would feed her. Because no one else would care. And perhaps at night, when the world cooled down and the flames dimmed, she sat in the dirt beside the kiln, let her hands rest, let the silence return, looked at the last pot drying beside her, and whispered, "That one's mine." We don't know how long she worked, how long she lived, whether she had children, or if they followed in her trade. We don't know if she ever made another piece that lasted. But we do know this. Pottery wasn't a peaceful pastime. It was punishing. It was precise. It was hard. And she did it anyway. Not for legacy, not for love, but because it was the only thing she had, the only way to survive in a world that never promised her comfort, praise or rest. And maybe that's what makes that little signature so powerful. Not that it came from an artist, but that it came from a worker, a woman with cracked skin and fire in her lungs, who dared to carve her name into something meant to break, and by doing so, didn't. It was only a name, scratched faintly along the base of a bowl, a handful of symbols, small enough to go unnoticed by most. No gold leaf, no royal seal, not even meant to last. And yet, it did. Out of all the pots that shattered, out of all the jars that crumbled beneath time and dust and disregard, this one survived, not because it was more beautiful, not because it was stronger, but because she had signed it. A name, that's all. But when history refuses to remember you, even that can be everything. Think about what it meant, for her, to carve her name into clay. She didn't live in a world that encouraged her voice. She wasn't writing scrolls or leading prayers. She didn't have a scribe to pen her words, or a monument to carry her legacy. No one was planning to remember her. Her work, her labour, her hands, they were meant to disappear. She was supposed to be silent. And yet, one day, maybe in the middle of a hot afternoon, when the clay was still soft and the workshop was finally quiet, she picked up a sharp stick, turned over a bowl, and pressed her name into the base. We don't know why. That's the haunting part. Because in that single act lives a universe of possibility. Maybe she was proud. Maybe that day, the bowl came out just right, the sides even, the glaze smooth, and she thought, this one's mine. Maybe she was defiant. Maybe the men in the workshop never let her sign anything before, and this was her moment of rebellion, a whisper against their authority. You may ignore me, but I am here. Or maybe it was fear. Maybe she knew she wouldn't be there tomorrow. Illness, pregnancy, a beating, a decision to marry her off. And in that moment, she carved her name as proof. I lived. I did something. I made this. Or maybe it was love. Maybe she had a daughter and wanted to show her what it meant to leave a mark. Or a friend. Or no one at all. Maybe it was just for her. A quiet secret between a woman and the earth she shaped. And isn't that the most human thing? To want to be known, if only briefly. To make something and say, this is mine. To leave something behind that says, I was here. We think of legacy as grand. Tombs, titles, stories told across centuries. But for her, legacy was a scratch on clay. A line of characters she probably learned as a child, passed down in spoken lessons, not schools. Written in hands that also baked bread and soothed children and bled from labour. And still, she signed it. Even knowing it might be erased, even knowing no one might care, there is something deeply brave about that, because in her time, signing your name wasn't common. It wasn't safe, especially not for a woman of low status, especially not in a culture that prized the collective over the individual. Even many men didn't sign their work. Pots were sold, traded, used, and then forgotten. The maker was never the story. But she changed that, just once. And maybe that's why we remember her now, because of what she didn't accept, because she claimed something when everything else around her told her not to. Her name isn't famous. You probably won't find it in textbooks. It's not carved into stone on the walls of a temple. Scholars debate its meaning, its pronunciation. But the fact that it exists at all is revolutionary. And it makes you wonder, what if more women signed their work? How many names did we lose because no one dared, or no one was allowed, to leave one behind? How many bowls were made by hands like hers? How many lamps lit homes because of her craft? How many stories died with their tellers because silence was the rule? In some way, this signature speaks for them too. It's not just hers anymore. It's every woman who wasn't supposed to be seen. Every hand that created but was never credited. Every soul that laboured in the margins and vanished before history could notice. And that's what makes this little act so powerful. Because when she pressed her name into clay, she pressed back against that silence. She made herself unerasable, even if it took 3,000 years for someone to notice. And now, we have. Now you know. You've heard her. She wasn't royalty. She wasn't divine. She wasn't trying to change the world. But she did something small, quiet, real. And that's the part the movies always miss. It's not just grand speeches or battles that shape history. Sometimes it's a woman, kneeling in a hot workshop, carving a name into wet clay, before it dries. because she knew that if she didn't, no one else would. After the bowl was fired, cooled, and stacked with the others, life went on. She likely didn't think about it again. The workshop kept spinning. New clay, new orders, new heat from the kiln. No one paused to marvel at what she'd done. No one held up her signed piece and asked, "Who made this?" It was just another pot, part of the everyday machinery of survival. People ate from it, washed it, maybe used it to hold oil or water. It sat on someone's shelf for weeks, maybe months. Then, like most things made for use, it cracked, or fell, or was discarded, buried in the trash pile behind a house, swallowed by time, and so was she. There's no tragedy in that, not at first. That was the rhythm of the ancient world. People lived, they worked, they died. Most were never remembered. No one built her a tomb. No priest spoke her name at a funeral. No monument carried her image through centuries. Even her name, etched carefully into the bowl, would have disappeared if not for luck or fate. But for a long, long time she was gone. Not just physically, historically. She didn't leave behind scrolls or stories. No one passed down her legend, because she wasn't one. She was never meant to be a symbol. She was just a person, one of millions, trying to make a living, trying to survive, trying to matter in a world that rarely made room for women like her. And when she was gone completely. The centuries rolled on without her. The pharaohs she lived under were buried in tombs the size of small cities. Priests chanted in temples where her feet had never dared to step. Empires rose and fell. New gods replaced old ones. Foreign kings marched through the desert, rewriting borders and burning cities. And beneath all that, the dust, the stone, the silence, her bowl lay still. Just a shard now, covered in earth. Forgotten, like the hand that shaped it. It's easy to think history remembers the important people, the powerful ones, the loud ones, the ones who wrote things down or had their lives written for them. But really, history remembers what happens to survive, not always what matters most. And that's why so many lives like hers disappeared. Not because they didn't matter, but because no one preserved them, because no one expected them to be remembered. But that changed one day. Thousands of years later, in a dig site not far from the edge of the Nile, an archaeologist brushed away a layer of dust and found a piece of pottery, broken, faded, nothing flashy, just a fragment. But on that fragment, just along the base, they saw it, a name. It wasn't a king's name. It wasn't part of a religious formula or a spell. It was personal, direct, ordinary, and that made it extraordinary. For a moment, time folded. The dig site fell silent, and in that silence, she returned. Not in flesh, not in full, but in presence. She had waited, not intentionally, not even hopefully, but her act, that simple carving, had outlived the workshop, the city, the empire. And now, someone had seen it. We don't know the moment she disappeared from the world. We don't know her last breath, her last meal, her final day in the sun. But we know that thousands of years later, someone picked up a piece of her life and whispered, "Who was she?" And that question matters, because it pulled her back, not completely, not with her face, her voice, her memories, but with something equally powerful, acknowledgement. For the first time in millennia, someone said, she existed, she mattered, she made something. That's more than most people get, even those with titles. Think about all the things that had to happen for her to be found again. The pot had to survive the fire, the usage, the breakage. It had to be buried, not burned. The earth had to hold it safely until the right tools, the right hands, uncovered it. And then, someone had to care enough to read the name, to not dismiss it, to not label it unknown worker, and move on. And so, by chance, or maybe something more, she was no longer invisible. But even as she returned to the record of human memory, the rest of her story remained quiet. We don't know what her face looked like, or what color her hair was. We don't know if she laughed easily, or kept to herself. We don't know if she had children, or what dreams she carried in her chest that never had room to grow. All we know is this: she lived, she worked, she signed her name, and then she disappeared. That disappearance doesn't diminish her. It defines the quiet truth of most human lives. We are not monuments, we are moments. But some moments last. Hers did. Not because someone else gave her permission, but because she took it. She signed her name, into a pot, into time, and then she vanished. But now, you remember her. That may not sound like much, but for someone like her, someone who was never supposed to be remembered at all, it's everything. She vanished. Yes, her name faded from memory. Her face was never captured in ink or stone. Her story, until now, was never told in full. But does that mean what she did? We didn't matter. We often treat history like a ladder. The higher someone climbs, the more they matter. Pharaohs, generals, kings. We imagine that impact only happens when you lead armies, write laws, break empires. But that's not how it works. Not really. Most of human history wasn't built by rulers. It was built by hands like hers, clay-stained, sunburned, tired, but still moving. She didn't change the course of a war. She didn't build a monument or give birth to a dynasty. But in one quiet moment, when the workshop was still, and her bowl was finally finished, she made a choice. She signed it, not because she thought anyone would remember, but because she knew what she did had value. Even if the world didn't see it, even if the world forgot. And that, right there, is where meaning lives. What does it mean to matter? For most of us, it won't come from glory. No statues, no headlines, no pages in textbooks. It comes from work, from care, from showing up and making something with whatever we have. A meal, a story, a bowl of clay. It comes from noticing that even if no one's watching, we still choose to leave something good behind, even when it seems small, even when no one asks for it. She didn't wait for permission to matter. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't need an audience to believe that her hands were doing something real. She simply did the work. And in doing it, she declared, "This is who I am, and that is enough." We live in a world obsessed with recognition, with followers, with fame, with numbers on a screen. But what if the truest legacy is something quieter? What if legacy isn't in being known, but in being honest? She made that bowl for someone else to use, to eat from, to drink from, to carry water, hold light, store grain. It wasn't about her. And yet, she still signed it, still whispered, in the simplest way, "I was here." There's something deeply human in that. We've been taught that to matter means to be big, loud, public, but real lives, like hers, prove the opposite. To matter is to act with care even when no one notices. To create something that makes someone else's life a little easier. To touch something and say, "This came from me." Not to be praised, just to be real. Think of the generations she never knew she would reach. She didn't imagine you, sitting here, now, thinking about her. She didn't picture her name being read aloud, centuries later, by strangers who speak a language she never heard. But here we are, because of one decision, one mark. Her name wasn't carved in stone, but it outlasted kingdoms. Her voice wasn't recorded, but we hear her still. She didn't wear gold, but she left something priceless. She left a trace, and that trace changes us. Not because she was powerful, but because she was real. In many ways, her story is your story. No, you may not work with clay. Maybe you write, or teach, or cook, or raise a child, or fix broken things, or sit in quiet rooms doing invisible tasks for people who will never thank you. Maybe you think what you do is small, but here's the truth. There's no such thing as small when it's done with care. That bowl she made, it held something. It helped someone. It survived storms, wars, empires, and time. And her name, just a scratch in clay, outlived those things too. So if you've ever wondered if what you do matters, if you've ever felt unseen or replaceable, remember her. She disappeared, but what she left behind didn't. And neither will you. You see, history doesn't remember us because we shout. It remembers us because we touch something that lasts, because we love something enough to shape it well. Because even when the world says, "You're nobody," we look down at what we've made and say, "But this is mine." It could be a pot, a poem, a kind word, a garden, a quiet moment of honesty with someone who needs it. None of it will make headlines. Most of it will fade, but not all. Somewhere, somehow, a piece might remain. And when someone finds it, they might pause. They might look at your work and say, "Who made this?" That question is an echo, and for a moment, it's enough to bring you back. So no, what she did wasn't meaningless. It was a bowl, a name, a decision. But inside that, there was dignity. There was defiance. There was beauty. Not the kind you hang on a wall, but the kind that makes you pause, that makes you feel less alone. She didn't need history to tell her she mattered. She already knew. And now, you do too. They tell history through kings and queens, gods and generals. They carve it into monuments and paint it on palace walls. They name it after dynasties and battles and crowns that shone under the desert sun. And for thousands of years, they've spoken of history as if it belonged only to those who ruled. But I lived, I worked, I loved, I bled, I died, and I was not powerful. I was not born in silk. I did not ride in litters, nor speak in courts, nor sign scrolls with seals dipped in wax. No record bears my name. No priest ever prayed for me aloud in the great temple halls. And yet, I was part of history, not by writing it, but by living it. History is not only what's remembered, it's also what was felt. The ache in my back after turning clay all day, that was history. The warmth of bread rising in a pot I shaped, history. The way a mother wept when her child's ashes were placed in a jar I'd fired with my own hands, that too was history. Not the kind they inscribe on stone, not the kind kings boast of, but history just the same. I was a potter, and I carried a civilization. You see, without people like me, without those who bent their backs, stained their hands, and labored in the heat of the earth, the world of the powerful could not stand. Pharaohs needed jars for perfume, bowls for food, urns for death. Priests needed cups for sacred oils. Soldiers needed vessels for rations. And families, hundreds, thousands, needed the simple things. A plate, a pot, a place to put the things they held dear. Every day, in the background of their conquests and proclamations, we worked, silently, faithfully. While scribes wrote the names of kings, we kept the world running. And yet, when people look back, they search only for gold and titles. They forget the hands that made the bowls that held that gold, the hands that dug the trenches for the foundations of palaces, the hands that baked bricks from mud while the architects received praise. We are the unseen, but not unimportant. History is not only about the loudest voices, it is also the quiet rhythm of millions of people who never shouted, but built, people like me. Sometimes I wonder who first decided that only the powerful deserve to be remembered. Was it the rulers themselves? The scribes, afraid to write of people without permission? Or perhaps it was time, sweeping us aside, brushing away those of us who did not leave grand monuments behind. But even time cannot erase everything, because now, centuries later, someone like you has stopped to listen, to read, to hear the breath of someone who lived on the edge of history's spotlight. You may not know my name, but now you know I existed, and that changes everything, because it means that memory, real memory, doesn't only belong to the powerful, it belongs to those who choose to remember, who choose to look beyond the palaces, into the alleys and workshops and fields and kitchens, who ask, "What was it like for her?" And I thank you for that. You might think that because I didn't change the world, I didn't matter. But changing the world is not always loud. Sometimes it's as small as making a pot that outlives its maker, a meal that warms a hungry child, a vessel that carries oil for a prayer, a quiet act that helps someone else keep going. History, I think, is not just what we do, it's what we enable. Because I made clay strong enough to carry water, someone survived a long journey across the sands. Because I sealed an urn tight, someone's grief had a resting place. Because I added a small design to a plate, someone smiled, maybe for the first time that day. I did not wear a crown, but I wore purpose. And purpose, when lived fully, leaves an echo. I used to wonder if history would ever remember someone like me, not as a symbol, not as a curiosity in a museum, but as a human being, someone who lived a whole, unrecorded life. And now maybe it does, because now you carry this with you, this voice, this thought, this story, and if you pass it on, even quietly, even once, then I am remembered. Not for glory, but for truth. You may never be written into textbooks, No one may build a statue of you. You may work your whole life doing quiet things no one thanks you for. But please, do not believe that makes you invisible. You are living history right now. The way you rise, the way you show up, the way you help others survive, even if they never notice. You shape the present the way I once shaped clay. And even if no one writes it down, your work matters. Your life matters. And maybe, one day, someone will stop, years from now, and wonder who made the thing they found, the system that worked, the meal that nourished, the care that softened a hard moment. Maybe they won't know your name, but maybe they'll feel your hands. And that is history, not just for the powerful, but for all of us. If you've stayed with me this long, through dust, through clay, through fire, then perhaps I owe you a name. No one ever carved it into stone. No one etched it into papyrus. But in my heart, I've carried it always. Naya. That was what my mother called me. The morning I first walked barefoot to the banks of the Nile, clay baskets slung across my back. A soft name, easily lost to the wind. But I whisper it to you now, not because I need to be remembered, but because it feels right to leave you with something more than silence. So yes, I am Naya, a woman with no statue, no scroll, no prayer in the temple, just hands. Hands that worked, hands that shaped, hands that left small, quiet signs beneath the pots I made, knowing no one would ask who they belonged to. And now, here you are, asking. That alone feels like enough. I have told you my story not to demand remembrance, but to offer you presence. To let you rest, for a while, in a world far away, one where life was hard, yes, but also slow, textured, grounded. A world without machines, without noise, without hurry. Just breath, just clay, just the rhythm of fire and form and silence. Perhaps you came here to fall asleep, or perhaps you just wanted a place where nothing demanded anything from you. If so, I hope I've given you that. In the end, my story is like one of my pots, imperfect, hand-spun, a little uneven, but made with care, and like any vessel, it holds something, not oil, not water, but stillness, gratitude, a reminder that even those of us who never wore crowns, who never raised swords or signed decrees, were still part of the story, that you too are part of it, not because of fame, but because of feeling, because you wondered, because you listened, because you saw the human in the dust. So now I'll go, as softly as I came, no grand farewell, no final twist, just a quiet thank you. Thank you for giving space to a forgotten voice. Thank you for sitting by the fire with me, if only in spirit. Thank you for remembering that history isn't just what's written down, it's what's lived. And thank you for carrying my name, if only for a moment. My name is Naya. I shaped clay. I watched fire. I lived. And now, I rest.